Envision the challenge of preserving food across a 1,500-mile journey without refrigeration, with peril lurking around every bend and outlaws poised to strike at any moment. Life on a cattle drive was exceptionally harsh for cowboys, yet their most formidable adversary was an empty stomach. While cinematic depictions often feature them battling brigands and herding cattle, their true struggle was against spoiled provisions and starvation. More cowboys succumbed to poor nutrition and disease than to armed conflicts. Consequently, the chuck wagon cook commanded the second highest salary on the trail, surpassed only by the trail boss himself. We are not referring to the solitary wanderers Hollywood often portrays, but rather to trail cowboys, men who spent months guiding thousands of cattle northward, subsisting on whatever the chuck wagon provided. Before delving into the provisions themselves, it's crucial to grasp the most pivotal invention in cowboy lore. Without this crucial piece of gear, the monumental cattle drives would have been unattainable. The chuck wagon was conceived in 1866 by Charles Goodnight, a preeminent cattleman in Texas history. Goodnight ingeniously transformed a surplus army wagon into a mobile kitchen and larder. The brilliance lay in its design. At the rear of the wagon, Goodnight constructed what he dubbed the chuck box, a cabinet equipped with drawers and shelves that folded down to form a workspace. Every item the cook required was conveniently accessible, neatly organized, and shielded from the elements. One compartment housed sourdough starter. Another held coffee beans, which were as valuable as gold on the trail. There were dedicated spaces for salt, sugar, dried beans, and the cook's cherished spices. However, storage was merely one aspect of the challenge. The chuck wagon featured a water barrel affixed to its side, typically holding around 30 gallons. This amount seems meager when considering the need to nourish 10 to 15 hungry cowboys thrice a day, does it not? That water had to suffice for cooking, coffee preparation, and occasional washing. Beneath the wagon, suspended by leather straps, hung a cowhide sling known as a possum belly. This held firewood and dried buffalo chips for fuel. When traversing the vast Great Plains, where timber is scarce, one utilizes whatever fuel is available, and indeed, dried buffalo dung burns quite effectively, imparting a less offensive odor than one might anticipate. The individual responsible for operating this wagon, affectionately termed Cookie or Koozie, governed it with an iron hand. Astute cowboys never antagonized the cook, for that man held the power to determine whether you feasted or went hungry. Now, let's discuss the singular most vital food item on any cattle drive. This particular ingredient sustained more cowboys than any other. Salt, pork, and bacon formed the bedrock of cowboy sustenance. A properly cured slab of bacon could remain palatable for months without refrigeration, even amidst the scorching Texas summer heat. The preservation process commenced long before the inception of the cattle drive. Ranchers would slaughter hogs in late autumn or early winter, with timing being paramount. Cold weather was essential to aid in preserving the meat during the curing phase. They would butcher the hog, section the meat into manageable portions, and then pack it in copious amounts of salt. Imagine a wooden barrel standing 3 feet tall. Now, picture it being filled with alternating layers of pork belly and coarse salt, each layer approximately 2 inches thick. The salt would extract moisture from the meat with greater efficiency than the desert sun draws sweat from one's brow. This was no mere sprinkling. We are talking about employing 8 to 10 pounds of salt for every 100 pounds of meat. The meat would remain in this salt cure for 4 to 6 weeks. During this period, the salt would permeate deep into the tissue, creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria. However, here's the catch. The salt-cured meat was so intensely salty, it was nearly inedible straight from the barrel. Cookie would have to immerse it in water for several hours, occasionally overnight, merely to render it palatable. Even then, its saltiness was sufficient to cause a modern physician's blood pressure to surge at the mere sight of it. A typical cattle drive would transport 200 to 300 pounds of salt pork for a crew of 12 to 15 men. This equates to about £1 per man per week, which may not sound like much, but recall that this was pure fat and protein, supplying the vital calories these men required for 16-hour workdays in the saddle. The fat was as precious as the meat itself. Cookie would render that bacon fat and meticulously save every drop. That grease found its way into everything: beans, biscuits, gravy, fried potatoes. Nothing was squandered. A cowboy might consume 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily during an arduous drive, and a substantial portion of those calories originated from bacon fat. Nevertheless, salt pork alone was insufficient to sustain a man. Cowboys required something substantial to nourish them, something that would fill their bellies and provide the energy needed for the arduous day ahead. There's a valid reason why beans feature prominently in every Western film, but what Hollywood portrays doesn't convey the complete narrative. Dried beans were perfectly suited for trail life. They were lightweight, compact, virtually indestructible, and could endure for years if kept dry. A 50-pound sack of pinto beans occupied less space than a saddle and could feed a crew for weeks. But here's what makes beans genuinely remarkable. They are one of the few foods that actually improve with age, up to a certain point. Dried beans could last 2 to 3 years in a sealed container. Even after a year on the trail, jostling in a chuck wagon through dust storms and river crossings, those beans would remain perfectly edible. The preparation was an all-day undertaking. Cookie would commence cooking the beans in the morning, sometimes even the night before. He'd pour several pounds of dried pintos into a Dutch oven, submerge them in water, and append a chunk of salt pork for flavor. Then, that pot would rest on the periphery of the campfire, slowly simmering for 6 to 8 hours. The outcome? Beans so tender they would melt in your mouth, immersed in a rich, porky broth that you would sop up with biscuits. This was not sophisticated cuisine, but after a protracted day of inhaling dust and wrestling cattle, it was superior to anything one might find in a metropolitan eatery. Now, I understand what you're contemplating. All those beans must have generated some intriguing circumstances around the campfire. And you would be correct. Cowboys had colorful appellations for the digestive ramifications. Prairie thunder, singing to the stars, and terms I cannot utter on this platform. Yet that was merely an integral aspect of trail life. A typical cattle drive would transport 100 to 150 pounds of dried beans. Some crews consumed beans twice daily, every single day, for months. One might assume they would tire of them, but when expending 5,000 calories daily, one is not particular about variety. Beans furnished protein, fiber, and complex carbohydrates, everything a working man required. In conjunction with salt pork, beans formed a complete protein that maintained cowboys' strength and health. However, beans and bacon alone do not constitute a complete meal. Cowboys needed something else, something that could be made fresh daily even in the remotest locations. Every chuck wagon carried something alive. Not a pet, not livestock, but something requiring daily care and attention. Lose this, and the cook might as well resign and return to Texas. Sourdough starter was the confidential asset of every trail cook and was revered like gold. This thriving culture of wild yeast and bacteria was the sole method for making bread rise without access to commercial yeast, which did not exist in a stable form at that time. Envision a ceramic crock, roughly the size of a coffee can, enveloped in a flour sack and nestled into the coziest corner of the chuck box. Within it resides a thick, effervescent mixture emitting a tangy, subtly sour aroma. That is the starter. Cookie would nourish it daily with flour and water, maintaining its vitality and activity. This was more than mere bread starter. It was a flourishing organism that some cooks nurtured for years, even decades. There are narratives of sourdough starters being inherited through generations, with some asserting their starter was 50 or 60 years old. Upon retirement, a cook would frequently bestow his starter upon his successor, akin to passing down a family heirloom. However, preserving sourdough on the trail was a delicate undertaking. Too hot and it would perish. Too cold and it would become inert. Should it become wet during a river crossing, one would have to recommence from scratch. That is why Cookie would sleep with the starter crock on frigid nights, utilizing his body heat to sustain its optimal temperature. You read that correctly. Cookie literally slept with his sourdough starter. Such was its importance. Each morning, Cookie would appropriate a portion of that starter and blend it with flour, salt, and a touch of bacon grease to fashion biscuits. These were not the airy biscuits found in contemporary restaurants. These were dense, robust, and substantial, what cowboys termed sinkers, because they would settle to the bottom of one's stomach and remain there. The procedure was straightforward, but demanded proficiency. Mix the dough, flatten it on the chuck wagon's fold-down table, cut it into rounds with a tin can, and place them in a Dutch oven. Then, one would pile glowing coals atop the lid and beneath the pot, creating an oven effect. 30 minutes later, fresh bread emerged in the heart of nowhere. A skilled cook could produce 50 to 60 biscuits in a single batch. Cowboys would cleave those biscuits open, douse them with bacon grease or sorghum molasses, and deem it an adequate meal. The advantage of sourdough lay in its preservative qualities. Those biscuits would remain edible for 2 to 3 days, even in warm weather. Cowboys would tuck a few into their saddlebags for their trail lunch. By afternoon, they might be as hard as rocks, but one could immerse them in coffee and they would soften right up. Yet biscuits were not the only necessity for cowboys to commence their day. There was one item they esteemed more than anything else on the trail. Now, we must address the solitary item cowboys prized above whiskey, tobacco, and perhaps even their horses. Should this commodity run out, a mutiny would surely ensue. Coffee fueled the cattle drives, with cowboys consuming it morning, noon, and night, often a gallon or more daily per person. This wasn't gourmet coffee, it was Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee, sold in single packages with a stick of peppermint candy. The candy wasn't a treat, but an incentive. Whoever volunteered to grind the coffee beans received the peppermint stick. This clever marketing by Arbuckle's proved highly effective. The coffee came as whole roasted beans, essential for preservation, as ground coffee would spoil within days, while whole beans lasted for months. Each morning, Cookie ground enough beans for the day using a hand crank grinder attached to the chuck wagon. The sound of that grinder signaled the start of the day, an alarm clock prompting cowboys to emerge from their bedrolls. The brewing method was simple, yet efficient. Cookie would pour 1 or 2 pounds of ground coffee into a large pot, holding 2 to 3 gallons, add water, and bring it to a boil. No filters or elaborate equipment, just coffee, water, and heat. To settle the grounds, once the coffee boiled, Cookie would add a handful of crushed eggshells or a cup of cold water. This caused the grounds to sink, leaving relatively clear coffee on top. Cowboys would pour carefully to avoid disturbing the sediment, though gritty last sips were common, hence the term cowboy coffee. It was renowned for being strong enough to float a horseshoe and thick enough to chew. One cowboy famously described it as coffee so robust you could stand a spoon in it, and if the spoon toppled, it needed more boiling. A typical cattle drive carried 50 to 100 pounds of coffee beans. Serving 15 men, each drinking 4 to 5 cups daily, meant rapid depletion. Running out of coffee was a grave concern, sometimes prompting trail bosses to dispatch a rider ahead to the next town for more supplies. While caffeine was important, coffee also served as a safe hydration source. Boiling the water eliminated bacteria from potentially tainted water sources. Many cowboys preferred coffee over plain water, a choice that proved beneficial, even if they were unaware of the scientific reasons. However, coffee and biscuits alone weren't enough. Cowboys needed additional sustenance to stay healthy during long months on the trail. They faced a historical menace similar to that endured by sailors: scurvy, a silent killer caused by a lack of vitamin C. Its symptoms included bleeding gums, loose teeth, weakness, and ultimately, death. Savvy trail bosses recognized this threat, making dried fruit, particularly dried apples, a necessity rather than a luxury. Before the drive, apples were thinly sliced, sun-dried for days until leathery, and then packed in cloth sacks. These dried apple rings could last for months and rehydrated when cooked with water and sugar. Cookie would prepare apple pie by stewing dried apples with sugar and cinnamon, sandwiching the mixture between layers of sourdough biscuit dough in a Dutch oven. Though different from homemade pie, it tasted heavenly after weeks of beans and bacon. Cowboys sometimes literally fought over the largest slice of apple pie. Dried peaches, apricots, and prunes were also common, with prunes serving the dual purpose of providing vitamin C and aiding digestion, which was often impacted by a diet heavy in meat and beans. Cowboys sarcastically called them prairie strawberries. Even if grocery store dried apricots are palatable, imagine them after 6 weeks of bouncing in a chuck wagon covered in trail dust, possibly with a hint of mold. Cookie would simply remove the affected parts and use the rest. Waste was not an option. The drying process was simple but time-consuming. Thin slices of fruit were laid in the sun for several days, turned regularly, then packed in cloth sacks and stored in the driest part of the wagon. Moisture was the enemy, as one damp sack could quickly become a moldy mess. When dried fruit was unavailable and fresh meat scarce, cowboys had to innovate with what they found on the trail. Surprisingly, cowboys rarely ate beef, even while herding thousands of cattle. The cattle were merchandise, not food. Each animal lost meant financial loss, so trail bosses only authorized slaughtering beef if an animal was injured beyond recovery or if the crew faced extreme hunger. When a beef was slaughtered, the problem of preservation arose in the absence of refrigeration. The solution? Consume as much as possible immediately and preserve the rest. Slaughter occurred in the evening, with cowboys butchering the animal. Cookie would immediately begin cooking, and the crew would feast on fresh steaks, roasts, and organ meats until morning, before spoilage set in. What couldn't be eaten fresh was thinly sliced by Cookie, and either smoked over a fire or sun-dried to make jerky. This was a race against time and flies, as meat could spoil in hours in summer heat. Cookie would work through the night, slicing, heavily salting, and hanging meat near the fire to smoke. Beef wasn't the sole source of fresh meat. Resourceful cowboys hunted along the trail, bagging jackrabbits, prairie chickens, wild turkeys, and occasionally deer or antelope. The challenge was ammunition. Bullets were expensive and reserved for protection, not hunting. A cowboy who wasted a bullet on a rabbit risked the trail boss's ire. Some crews devised creative solutions, catching fish during river crossings or gathering wild bird eggs. One account describes a crew catching a 40-pound catfish during a river crossing, which Cookie cooked into a stew that fed everyone for 2 days. Prairie chickens provided the best fresh meat, being plentiful on the Great Plains. A skilled shot could bag several with one shotgun blast. Cookie would fry them in bacon grease, and cowboys would vigorously dispute who got the drumsticks. When all else failed, and food supplies dwindled dangerously low, every chuck wagon had a final safeguard. An emergency food supply that could last indefinitely and sustain a man when all other provisions were gone. This sustenance was so hard it could chip teeth, but was crucial for survival. Hardtack, also called pilot bread or ship's biscuit, was the ultimate survival food. Made from just flour, water, and salt, these crackers were baked until bone dry and as rigid as wood, capable of lasting for years without spoiling. Imagine a cracker roughly 3 inches square and an inch thick, too hard to bite through. Cowboys would soak it in coffee or water to soften it, or Cookie would break it apart with a hammer to thicken stews. The preservation method was simple. Remove all moisture, preventing bacterial and mold growth. A box of hardtack could remain in the chuck wagon for an entire season and still be edible, even if infested with weevils, which cowboys would simply knock off, joking about the extra protein. Cowboys had a saying about hardtack: "It's the only food that fights back." They'd tap it on the table to dislodge weevils, and many would eat it in the dark to avoid seeing what they were chewing. Hardtack was never a choice food due to its blandness, hardness, and cardboard-like appeal. But when stranded 3 days from the nearest town, with most supplies lost in a river crossing, hardtack could be the only barrier between life and starvation. Cookie sometimes prepared skilgal, hardtack soaked in water, then fried in bacon grease, transforming an inedible ration into something resembling real food. Prudent trail bosses always kept 50 to 100 pounds of hardtack in reserve, stored in a waterproof container as insurance against disaster. But hardtack wasn't the only backup plan. The Great Plains themselves offered sustenance for those who knew where to look. The plains weren't as barren as they seemed. Cowboys with knowledge could supplement their diet with wild, edible plants, though one mistake could be fatal. Experienced cowboys and cooks learned to identify edible plants like wild onions, prairie turnips, and prickly pear cactus. These weren't merely supplements. Sometimes they made the difference between health and scurvy. Wild onions grew in patches, detectable by smell. Cookie would send cowboys to harvest a sackful, adding much-needed flavor and vitamin C to the evening's beans. Though the concept of vitamins was unknown then, they simply understood that fresh vegetables promoted health. The prickly pear cactus represented another significant discovery. Its pads, once meticulously stripped of their spines, could be cooked over an open flame. Their flavor resembled green beans, though with a somewhat viscous consistency. The fruit, upon reaching full ripeness, offered a delightful sweetness and juiciness, a true indulgence in the arid expanse. Cowboys affectionately dubbed the prickly pear the vegetable that fights back, because even after meticulous removal of its spines, miniature needles would embed themselves in one's fingers for days. Prairie turnips, also known as Indian breadroot, were a fundamental food source for the Plains Indians, a practice some cowboys learned to adopt. These subterranean vegetables could be consumed raw, roasted, or dehydrated, and then pulverized into flour. Their starchy and satiating qualities offered a welcome diversion from a diet heavy in beans. The principal challenge lay in their discovery. They grew deeply embedded and mandated an understanding of the plant's surface appearance to pinpoint optimal digging locations. However, foraging presented hazards. Ingesting an incorrect plant could lead to fatal consequences before dawn. Water hemlock, visually akin to wild parsnip, possessed lethal toxicity. Loco weed agitated livestock, including cattle and horses, and posed a risk to human health as well. Only seasoned individuals collected wild plants, and even then they proceeded with considerable caution. There are records of entire crews developing illnesses from the consumption of inappropriate mushrooms or roots. Certain crews would harvest wild plums, grapes, or berries when available. The cook would prepare preserves by simmering the fruit with sugar, subsequently storing the concoction in jars. These preserves held immense value. A mere spoonful on a biscuit served as a treasured luxury, evoking nostalgic sentiments of home for the cowboys. Mesquite beans constituted another valuable resource in the Southwest. These could be milled into flour or simmered into a sweet syrup. They were readily available, abundant, and nutrient-rich. Cowboys traversing the southern routes assimilated these culinary survival tactics from Mexican vaqueros and Native Americans. Astute cowboys observed and emulated the dietary practices of local inhabitants. From preserved salt pork to sourdough starters and wild prairie turnips, these preservation methods transcended mere survival strategies. They formed the bedrock that enabled the colonization of the American West. Absent these techniques, there would have been no vast cattle drives, no nascent frontier settlements, nor the enduring legend of the cowboy. Each meal represented a minor triumph against an environment indifferent to human survival. If this video resonated with you, please press the like button and subscribe for further narratives.